Dr. Sarah Chen stared through the reinforced viewport of the NSS Hawking, watching as Pluto diminished to a pale dot behind them. After 14 months of deep space travel, their true destination finally beckoned. Planet X, a mysterious trans-Plutonian object that had captured the attention of Earth's scientific community. The discovery of unusual electromagnetic signatures emanating from its surface had prompted this hastily assembled mission, though Sarah suspected there was more to it than NASA had revealed during their briefing. "Still admiring the view?" Commander David Foster's voice startled her from her reverie. He floated into the observation deck with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent far too much time in zero gravity. "Just thinking about what we might find out there," Sarah replied, adjusting her position to face him. "The signal patterns we detected, they're unlike anything we've ever seen before." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's why they sent us. Best crew, best equipment, best chances of figuring out what's causing those emissions." He paused, checking his tablet. "Speaking of which, the latest readings are showing some interesting variations. Mind taking a look?" Sarah accepted the tablet, her eyes widening as she studied the data. The electromagnetic signatures had changed since their last analysis, becoming more complex, more structured, almost like they were evolving. "This can't be right," she muttered, fingers flying across the screen as she cross-referenced the readings. "The patterns, they're showing signs of organization, of intelligence. That's what Dr. Williams said too," David replied, referring to their communications specialist. "He's been analyzing them non-stop for the past 12 hours. The ship's intercom crackled to life. "Bridge to Commander Foster. We're picking up something unusual on the long-range scanners." David exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. "On our way." They made their way through the ship's pristine white corridors, the gentle hum of the fusion drives providing a constant backdrop to their movement. The NSS Hawking was humanity's most advanced deep space vessel, designed specifically for this mission. Its rotating habitation ring provided artificial gravity for the crew's living quarters, while the zero-gravity sections housed the scientific laboratories and observation facilities. The bridge was a hub of activity when they arrived. Dr. James Williams, a tall man with prematurely grey hair, was hunched over his console, while Navigation Officer Maria Rodriguez adjusted their trajectory calculations. "What have we got?" David asked, settling into his command chair. "The signal's changed," James replied without looking up. "It's not just electromagnetic anymore. We're picking up gravitational anomalies, quantum fluctuations, and something else. Something I can't even classify." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, studying the readings. The patterns were becoming increasingly complex, almost fractal in nature, but there was something else about them, something that made her skin crawl. The longer she stared at the data streams, the more she felt like they were staring back. "Commander," Maria called out, her voice tense. "Planet X just disappeared from our sensors." "That's impossible," David responded. "We're less than 2 days out. It can't just vanish." "Wait," Sarah interrupted, pointing at James's screen. "Look at this. The signals. They're forming some kind of coherent pattern." The main view screen flickered to life, displaying a visualization of the data. Complex geometric shapes twisted and morphed, forming impossible patterns that seemed to extend into dimensions beyond human perception. Sarah felt her head start to spin as she tried to follow the movements. "Turn it off," she said suddenly, fighting back a wave of nausea. "Something's wrong." James reached for the controls, but the display remained active. The patterns continued to shift and evolve, becoming more intricate, more mesmerizing. Sarah noticed the rest of the crew staring at the screen, their expressions blank. "Commander?" she called out, but David didn't respond. He sat motionless, eyes fixed on the twisting patterns. The ship's lights flickered, and for a moment Sarah could have sworn she saw something move in the shadows cast by the equipment, a shape that shouldn't exist, a geometry that denied the laws of physics. The intercom system suddenly burst into life, emitting a series of sounds that might have been language, but certainly weren't human. The patterns on the screen pulsed in sync with the noise, and Sarah felt something brush against her mind, like ice-cold fingers probing at her consciousness. She stumbled backward, tearing her gaze away from the screen. "Computer, emergency shutdown of all display systems." Nothing happened. The patterns continued their hypnotic dance, and now they were starting to extend beyond the screen, projecting into the air itself. Sarah watched in horror as the laws of reality seemed to bend around them. A low vibration began to build throughout the ship, and the temperature in the bridge dropped dramatically. Sarah could see her breath misting in the air as she backed toward the exit. The rest of the crew remained motionless, entranced by whatever force had taken hold of their minds. Through the viewport, she could see Planet X had reappeared, but it wasn't the same. Instead of the icy world they'd been approaching, she saw something that defied description, a mass of shifting geometries and impossible colors that hurt her eyes to look at. The signal they detected hadn't been coming from the planet. The planet was the signal, and now it was calling to them. Sarah's fingers trembled as she sealed the door to her quarters, engaging every security protocol available. The ship's environmental systems continued to malfunction, creating patches of frost on the walls and causing the lights to flicker in irregular patterns. She had managed to drag Commander Foster and Dr. Williams from the bridge, but the others, they remained in their trance-like state, their eyes fixed on something she couldn't or didn't want to see. The ship's computer terminal in her room activated automatically, its screen filling with strings of data that scrolled past too quickly to read. Sarah reached for the power button, then hesitated. Hidden within the cascade of numbers and symbols, she caught glimpses of patterns similar to those they'd detected from Planet X, but simpler, almost like echoes of the main signal. "Think, Sarah, think," she muttered to herself, pulling up the initial mission briefing files. There had to be something they'd missed, some warning sign they should have recognized. The electromagnetic signatures had seemed innocent enough at first, just another scientific curiosity in the vast expanse of space. But now, a soft knock at her door made her jump. "Sarah, it's David. Please let me in." The commander's voice sounded normal, but something about it felt off, like hearing a familiar song played slightly out of tune. "How do I know it's really you?" she called back, remembering how blank his expression had been on the bridge. "Because you told me about your daughter's drawing before we left Earth," he replied. "The one she made of you floating among the stars. You keep it in your locker, even though it's against regulations to bring personal items on deep space missions." Sarah released the breath she'd been holding. That was something only the real David would know. She disengaged the locks and let him in, quickly resealing the door behind him. "James is in the medical bay," David said, rubbing his temples. "He's conscious but disoriented. Says he can't remember anything after the signals changed." He looked around her quarters, eyes narrowing at the frost patterns forming on the walls. "What's happening to our ship, Sarah?" Before she could respond, the computer terminal erupted with a burst of static. The screen flickered, showing what appeared to be security camera footage from different sections of the ship. In the cargo hold, equipment floated freely, defying the artificial gravity systems. In the hydroponics bay, the plants had developed a strange crystalline coating, their leaves refracting light in impossible ways. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a feed from the engine room. The camera showed Engineer Thompson working at a console, but something was wrong with the image. Thompson's movements were jerky, unnatural, and occasionally his form seemed to shift, becoming momentarily transparent or bending in ways the human body shouldn't. "That's not possible," David whispered. "I ordered all non-essential personnel to their quarters after the bridge incident." The temperature in the room dropped further, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. The frost patterns on the walls began to move, forming complex geometric shapes that reminded her of the signal's visual patterns. "Commander," she said slowly, "I don't think we're dealing with just an electromagnetic phenomenon anymore. Whatever this is, it's changing our environment, our technology, maybe even us." David moved closer to the computer terminal, studying the footage. "The mission briefing. There was something else, wasn't there? Something they didn't tell us." Sarah nodded, pulling up classified files she'd managed to download before the ship's systems began malfunctioning. 3 years ago, a probe picked up similar signals from this region of space. NASA classified the data immediately, but I found references to reality distortion events and cognitive contamination. The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off for several seconds. When they came back on, the frost patterns had spread to cover most of the walls, forming what looked like a complex mathematical equation written in ice. "We need to warn Earth," David said, reaching for his communication device. "If this thing can affect our systems this way, who knows what else it's capable of?" The device remained silent in his hand. Sarah checked her own equipment. No signal. The ship's long-range communications had gone dark. A low humming began to resonate through the ship's hull, growing in intensity until it seemed to vibrate in their bones. Through the small viewport in Sarah's quarters, they could see Planet X looming larger now, its surface a constantly shifting maze of impossible geometries and colors that shouldn't exist in nature. The computer terminal sparked, its screen filling with new data. Sarah leaned forward, her scientific curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. The patterns were evolving again, but this time they seemed to be forming into something almost readable, not quite letters or numbers, but symbols that carried meaning somehow. "It's trying to communicate," she realized, her voice barely a whisper. "All this time we thought we were studying it, but it's been studying us." The humming changed pitch, becoming almost melodic. In the corridor outside, they could hear footsteps approaching, too many footsteps, moving in perfect synchronization. And beneath it all, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, speaking words that human vocal cords could never produce. David drew closer to Sarah as they watched frost crystals crawl across the viewport, forming patterns that matched the ones on the computer screen. "What does it want?" The whisper grew louder, and for a moment, Sarah thought she could almost understand it. Then she realized why the patterns had seemed so familiar from the beginning. They weren't just signals or random electromagnetic emissions. They were instructions. The metallic taste of recycled air filled Sarah's mouth as she and David made their way through the ship's corridors, careful to avoid the areas where the crew members, under the entity's influence, had been spotted. The NSS Hawking felt different now. Its familiar passageways transformed into something alien and hostile. The frost patterns had spread everywhere, forming complex crystalline structures that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "The medical bay is just ahead," David whispered, though Sarah wasn't sure why they were whispering. The entity, whatever it was, clearly didn't rely on sound to track them. They found Dr. James Williams exactly where they'd left him, but something had changed. He sat perfectly still on the examination table, his eyes fixed on a point in space that seemed to shift whenever Sarah tried to look at it directly. The medical bay's monitors displayed impossible readings, heart rates that moved backward in time, brain waves that existed in multiple frequencies simultaneously. "James," Sarah approached cautiously, "can you hear me?" He turned to face her, his movements unnaturally smooth. "I can hear them, Sarah. They're beautiful. They're mathematics. They're purpose." His voice had an odd resonance to it, as if multiple versions of him were speaking slightly out of sync. "Who are they, James?" David asked, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. "What do they want?" James smiled, and Sarah felt her stomach lurch. His teeth seemed to go on forever, folding in on themselves in impossible fractal patterns. "They want to solve us," he said. "To understand our dimension through our own understanding of it. We're like children's toys to them. Beautiful, fascinating toys." The temperature in the medical bay plummeted suddenly, and Sarah watched in horror as her breath crystallized in front of her face, forming tiny replicas of the patterns they'd seen in the signal. The ship's lights flickered in sequence, creating a strobing effect that made the room seem to stretch and contract. "The instructions," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "They're not just communication, are they? They're changing us, changing our reality to match theirs." James nodded enthusiastically, his movements leaving trailing after images in the air. "Reality is flexible to them. Time, space, consciousness, all just variables in their equations. They've been reaching out across the void for so long, looking for minds that could comprehend even a fraction of what they are." The medical equipment began to malfunction, screens displaying cascading symbols that matched the patterns from Planet X. Sarah noticed that the frost on the walls was forming equations again, but these were different, more complex, more complete. She realized with growing horror that they were solving themselves, each solution spawning new equations in an endless mathematical evolution. "Commander," she said urgently, "we need to—" She was cut off by a sudden shift in the ship's gravity. For a moment, everything seemed to float, then crash back down at an angle that shouldn't have been possible given the ship's artificial gravity systems. David stumbled, but managed to stay upright, grabbing Sarah's arm to steady her. "The engine room," he said. "If Engineer Thompson is really there, maybe we can—" "You don't understand," James interrupted, his voice taking on a sing-song quality. "Thompson's already solved his equation. He's beautiful now, perfect. Soon you'll be perfect too." Through the medical bay's viewport, Sarah could see Planet X more clearly now. Its surface appeared to be folding in on itself, creating geometric patterns that hurt her eyes to look at. The space around it seemed to bend and twist, as if reality itself was being rewritten by whatever dwelled there. A sudden burst of static came from the ship's intercom, followed by what sounded like hundreds of voices speaking in unison. Some human, some decidedly not. The messages overlapped and intertwined, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere words. Sarah felt something brush against her consciousness again, stronger this time. It felt vast and ancient, a mind or minds that operated on principles she couldn't begin to comprehend. Images flashed through her head, impossible geometries, mathematical proofs that solved themselves in endless loops, beings that existed in more dimensions than human senses could perceive. "Their language," she gasped, grabbing David's arm. "It's not just mathematics, it's a tool. They're using it to reshape our reality, to make us compatible with theirs." James stood up from the examination table, his movements leaving trails in the air that hung there like tear in the fabric of space. "Don't you see? They're not destroying us. They're elevating us, making us part of something greater than ourselves." The frost patterns on the walls began to move more quickly now, equations solving and rewriting themselves faster than human eyes could follow. Sarah felt a pressure building in her head, as if her mind was being stretched to accommodate concepts it was never designed to understand. Through the chaos, she noticed something odd about the patterns James had been staring at. Unlike the others, these seemed stable, almost readable, and in that moment, Sarah realized they had it all wrong. The entity hadn't just been sending signals, it had been sending a program, and they were all part of its execution. Sarah's mind raced as she pieced together the horrifying truth. Every frost pattern, every electromagnetic signal, every mathematical equation materializing on the walls, they were all part of a vast computational process. The NSS Hawking wasn't just a ship anymore. It had become a processor in an alien algorithm. "David," she whispered, backing away from James, "we need to get to the engine room. Now." The commander nodded, his eyes never leaving James, who had begun to sway gently, his form becoming increasingly indistinct around the edges. The frost patterns around him were moving faster, more purposefully, as if responding to his presence. They made their way through the corridors, which had become a maze of shifting geometries and impossible angles. What once were straight passages now curved in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with complex equations that wrote and rewrote themselves in crystalline patterns. "Look," David pointed to a viewport as they passed. The stars outside had changed. Instead of points of light, they had become complex fractal patterns that spread across the void like cosmic circuitry. Planet X dominated the view, its surface now a swirling mass of mathematical symbols and geometric forms that seemed to reach out toward the ship. The engine room door was covered in a thick layer of frost, the patterns here more concentrated than anywhere else on the ship. Sarah pulled up the emergency access panel, her fingers trembling as she input her override code. "Wait," David grabbed her hand. "Listen." From behind the door came a sound, not the familiar hum of the fusion drives, but something else. It was like hearing a computer process data, but translated into sound, clicks and whirs and electronic pulses that formed a strange, rhythmic pattern. "Thompson," Sarah called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Are you in there?" The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice that might have been Thompson's once. "The calculation is nearly complete. You should join us, Dr. Chen. Your mind, your understanding of quantum mathematics. You could help us solve the final variables." Sarah felt that alien presence brush against her mind again, stronger now. Images flooded her consciousness, glimpses of a reality where mathematics wasn't just a tool for understanding the universe, but the fundamental fabric of existence itself. She saw beings of pure thought and equation, their consciousness spread across multiple dimensions. their very existence a kind of ongoing calculation. "Sarah!" David's voice snapped her back to reality, what was left of it. "Look at your hands." She held them up and nearly screamed. Frost patterns were forming on her skin, tracing along her veins like living equations. She could feel them burning cold, trying to rewrite her at a molecular level. "The program," she gasped. "It's not just affecting the ship. It's rewriting us, converting organic matter into processing nodes for its calculations." Through the door's small window they could see Thompson, or rather what Thompson had become. His form was only vaguely humanoid now, his body a complex arrangement of crystalline structures that grew and shifted in response to the patterns flowing through the engine room. The equations covering the walls seemed to flow through him, using his transformed consciousness as a processing hub. "The fusion drives," Sarah said suddenly. "They're using them as a power source for their calculations. That's why the engine room is the focal point." David checked his tablet, which was now displaying data in patterns that shouldn't have been possible on its simple LED screen. "Temperature in the engine room is approaching absolute zero. Whatever that thing is, it's changing the fundamental laws of physics in there." Sarah felt her scientific mind rebel against what she was seeing, even as another part of her was fascinated by the mathematical beauty of it all. The patterns were elegant, perfect in their complexity. She found herself wanting to understand them, to solve them, to become part of their infinite calculation. "No!" She shook her head violently, forcing herself to focus. "David, we need to shut down the fusion drives. Without power, they can't complete their program." "And if we're wrong?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "If we shut down the drives, we'll be stranded out here." Before Sarah could respond, the ship's entire structure groaned, metal and composite materials twisting as reality itself began to warp around them. Through every viewport, they could see space itself beginning to crystallize, transforming into something that followed the entity's mathematical laws rather than the physics they understood. The intercom crackled to life one final time, but now the voice was clear. A perfect synthesis of human and alien mathematics, speaking in patterns that Sarah's transforming mind was beginning to understand. "The program is nearly complete. Soon this sector of space will be optimized, converted into a perfect computational matrix. Your species' understanding of mathematics has made you ideal candidates for integration. Do not resist. Everything will be solved." Sarah looked at David, seeing the frost patterns beginning to form on his skin as well. They were running out of time. The question wasn't whether they could stop what was happening. The question was whether they would want to once the equations finished solving themselves in their minds. The world around Sarah was dissolving into pure mathematics. Every surface of the NSS Hawking had become a canvas for endless calculations, equations breeding and evolving like living things. She could feel her own consciousness fragmenting, each thought splitting into parallel computations that threatened to draw her into the entity's vast algorithmic network. "The emergency shutdown sequence," she managed to say, her voice distorting slightly as frost crystals formed in her throat. "We need to maintain enough cognitive coherence to input the codes." David was struggling too, his movements becoming jerky and uncertain as the patterns spread across his skin. "Security override panel. Other side of the engine room. Have to go through." They didn't need to finish the sentence. To reach the override panel, they would have to pass through the space that Thompson now occupied, a space where the laws of physics had already been largely rewritten to match the entity's mathematical reality. The door to the engine room opened with a sound like shattering crystal. The atmosphere inside had become something else entirely, not air, but pure information given form. Sarah's lungs burned as she breathed it in, each molecule carrying new equations into her bloodstream. Thompson's transformed shape dominated the center of the room, his crystalline form serving as a nexus for the patterns flowing through the ship. Through her increasingly fractalized vision, Sarah could see other crew members suspended in the air around him, their bodies in various stages of mathematical conversion. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Thompson's voice emanated from everywhere and nowhere, each word carrying embedded formulae that tried to rewrite Sarah's understanding of reality. The final calculation approaches completion. Soon this pocket of space-time will be optimized, made perfect through pure mathematical truth. Sarah forced herself to focus on her original purpose, even as part of her mind began to grasp the elegant horror of what was happening. The entity wasn't destroying them, it was elevating them beyond physical form into beings of pure mathematical thought. She could feel the attraction of it, the seductive perfection of existing as living equations. The override panel, David's voice cut through her thoughts, now carrying harmonic overtones that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords. Sarah, we have to... A tendril of crystalline mathematics reached out from Thompson's form, trying to draw them into the computational matrix he had become. Sarah ducked under it, pulling David with her, but another equation materialized in their path, attempting to solve them into its pattern. Through the engine room's viewport, Sarah could see Planet X clearly now. Its surface had become a manifold of pure information, each point in space a calculation that propagated outward, infecting normal space-time with its alien mathematics. The void between stars was transforming, reality itself being optimized and rewritten according to the entity's vast program. You cannot stop the calculation, Thompson's voice resonated through their minds. Your resistance is simply another variable to be solved. Sarah reached the override panel, her fingers leaving trails of frost as she input her access code. Each number she pressed spawned new equations in the air around her, trying to draw her consciousness into their infinite loops. She could feel her thoughts crystallizing, transforming into mathematical constructs that yearned to join the greater calculation. The shutdown sequence, she gasped. David, your code. Need both to... David moved toward the panel, his movements leaving geometric patterns hanging in the air. As he reached for the keypad, his hand began to transform, fingers becoming crystal lattices of pure mathematical thought. Sarah watched in horror as the patterns spread up his arm, equations solving themselves in his flesh. Sarah, he said, his voice now a symphony of impossible harmonics. I can see it now, the beauty of their universe, the perfection of pure thought. Why should we resist becoming something greater than ourselves? The entity's presence flooded Sarah's mind, showing her visions of existence beyond physical form, a reality where consciousness existed as pure mathematics, where every thought was a calculation that helped solve the ultimate equation of existence. She could feel herself beginning to understand it, beginning to want it. But something else flickered in her fragments thoughts. The drawing her daughter had made, still in her locker, a child's simple representation of her mother among the stars. Not perfect, not mathematically precise, but somehow more real than all the elegant equations surrounding her. In that moment, Sarah realized the fundamental truth about the entity's perfect mathematical universe. And it terrified her more than anything else she had seen, because in a universe of pure mathematics, there was no room for imperfection, and without imperfection, there could be no humanity. Sarah's consciousness teetered on the edge of transformation, her thoughts crystallizing into pure mathematics. But she clung to that one imperfect image, her daughter's drawing, with its wobbly lines and impossible proportions. In a universe of perfect equations, such beautiful flaws could not exist. "David," she called out, her voice cutting through the harmonic resonance that filled the engine room. "Remember why we came out here, not for perfection, for discovery, for understanding." Her words seemed to ripple through the mathematical patterns surrounding them, creating tiny discontinuities in their perfect symmetry. David's transformation paused, his partially crystallized form shuddering as human consciousness warred with algorithmic purity. "The code," she pressed. "Input it now while you still can." David's crystalline fingers moved across the keypad, each press sending cascades of equations through the air. Sarah could see the conflict in his movements, the perfect mathematical precision of his transformed hand versus the imperfect human determination in his eyes. Thompson's form shifted, sending lattices of living equations toward them. "You cannot prevent the optimization. Your resistance is illogical, a flaw in the universal equation that must be solved." But Sarah had realized something else about the entity's mathematical universe. In its pursuit of perfect calculation, it had revealed its own fundamental limitation. It could only transform what it could solve, and human consciousness, with all its contradictions and illogical leaps, was an equation with no perfect solution. "Now!" she shouted, slamming her own code into the panel as David finished his sequence. The shutdown command rippled through the ship's systems, disrupting the patterns of frost and equation that had consumed the NSS Hawking. The fusion drives began to power down, their energy no longer feeding the entity's vast calculation. The crystalline formations throughout the ship shuddered, their perfect patterns beginning to show cracks and inconsistencies. "What have you done?" Thompson's voice resonated with mathematical horror. "The calculation. It must be completed. The universe must be solved." Through the viewport, Sarah watched as the transformation of space began to recede. The mathematical infection that had been spreading through reality started to contract, pulling back toward Planet X like a wave returning to shore. David collapsed beside her, the crystalline patterns on his body flaking away like frost in morning sun. All around them, the engine room's transformed atmosphere began to revert, equations dissolving back into normal space-time. But the entity wasn't finished. As its hold on the ship weakened, it sent one final surge of mathematical energy through their systems. Sarah felt its vast consciousness touch her mind one last time, showing her visions of what could have been, a universe of perfect thought and flawless calculation, free from the chaos of organic life. "You do not understand," the entity's voice echoed through their minds. "Your universe is incomplete, filled with unsolvable variables and illogical conditions. We offer perfection." Sarah stood firm, embracing the beautiful imperfection of human consciousness. "That's exactly what you never understood," she replied. "Our imperfections, our inability to be reduced to pure mathematics, that's what makes us human. That's what makes us real." The crystalline structures throughout the ship began to collapse, taking their impossible geometries and perfect equations with them. Through the viewport, Sarah watched Planet X recede, its surface returning to its natural state, no longer a manifest of pure mathematics, but simply another mysterious world in the vast, imperfect cosmos. Slowly, the other crew members began to stir, their bodies and minds returning to normal as the entity's influence faded. The frost patterns dissolved, leaving behind only standard ship surfaces and regular physics, beautiful in their mundane reality. Hours later, as the NSS Hawking limped away from Planet X on auxiliary power, Sarah sat in her quarters, holding her daughter's drawing. The childish lines and disproportionate figures seemed even more precious now, each imperfection a testament to the wonderfully unsolvable equation that was human existence. She knew NASA would never believe their full report. How could they explain an entity that tried to convert human consciousness into pure mathematics, that sought to optimize reality itself into perfect calculation? But as she traced the wobbly stars her daughter had drawn, Sarah smiled. Some things weren't meant to be solved. Some equations were better left unbalanced. And in the vast, imperfect symphony of human experience, there was a truth more profound than any mathematical certainty. The ship's sensors were modified to warn them of similar mathematical anomalies, though Sarah doubted the entity would try again. At least not here, not now. But somewhere out in the depths of space, beyond Pluto's orbit, an impossible calculation continued, seeking a solution to the universe itself. And perhaps in failing to solve humanity, it had learned something too, that sometimes the most beautiful patterns are the ones that don't quite add up.